Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be an overview that I've read or been reading. I've been picking my way through Ben Kiernan's Blood and Soil, A World History of Genocide and Extermination from Sparta to Darfur, for the past month and a half or so. This is a big, thick reference book. It doesn't go in depth as something that's such a many thousands of years. It's not really the kind of book that you read straight through. I've been going in and out as I've been reading other things and as I've had conversations about things. So it's not really a book that I'm reading in order, but it is very interesting and it has a great reference section. It's a good starting point to picking up other things. The author, Ben Kiernan, is the director of the Genocide Studies program at Yale, which I had no idea was a thing, but apparently that's a thing. In any case, if you're interested in an overview of the horrible things that humans have done to other humans over the course of several thousand years, yeah, this is a nice is wrong. It's a good overview. Speaking of uglier parts of human history, next up, if you follow me on Instagram, you'll have seen me post about this. This is Joe Sacco's Paying the Land, which takes a look at Dene communities in the Northwest Territories in Canada. If you are a Canadian over the age of 35, you might know of the Dene as the people in the community in the evening soap opera North of 60 from the 90s. If you are not a Canadian over the age of 35, the Dene are one of the First Nations that are up in the north and in some of the northernmost regions of Canada. And in this book, Joe Sacco, who's a comics journalist, is driving the winter road, which is essentially roads that are not paved or developed roads. They're done over snow and ice. So these are communities that during the summer would be fly-in only. And if you've ever seen any of those things on social media where people show a plate of vegetables that's $70, those are fly-in communities. He goes through basically the history of the colonial history, the residential school history, the history of the mining and then oil and gas industries that are going into these areas and then coming out because now we're in the bust. So as well as getting into the suicide epidemic that's been plaguing a lot of northern communities and First Nations communities. And he does it in his usual really brilliant style. This is Joe Sacco's first long-form piece of comics journalism in, I think, more than 10 years. He's done a lot of short ones. I think I've talked about his collection of shorter works, journalism. He's just brilliant. A lot of his best-known work has been about Palestine and about Bosnia in the 90s. And this is definitely of the same caliber. I think reading this as a Canadian, where a lot of the Indigenous or Aboriginal issues have been in the forefront of a lot of political conversations, especially since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it's interesting to see this from an outside perspective because Joe Sacco he's originally Maltese, but he's American now. And so he brings that outsider's perspective. So he's giving a much broader overview than I think material that's written for Canadians who are kind of expected to have seen at least some of these things in the news. So that was really great. And I think if you want an overview of, how many times am I using the word overview here? But it really is a brilliant overview. So yeah, well worth picking up. And if you are not familiar with comics journalism, Joe Sacco is really he's the master of that form of journalism. So if you have never picked up any of his work, you can certainly start with this one. Next up, I read a book that I think kind of overpromised on what it actually goes into. This is Kwame Appiah, The Lies That Bind, Rethinking Identity. He is a professor at New York University, and he's spent basically his entire professional life in the United States, but he is actually British by birth and grew up going between the UK and Ghana. He has an English mother and a Ghanaian father. This book kind of promises to be kind of a deconstruction of elements of identity. He opens it by commenting that, for example, when people meet him, the first three things that they notice are that he is male, that he is not white, but they can't tell what exactly he is, and that he has a very posh RP, Queen's English, whatever you want to call that, accent. He doesn't really dig too far into the gender piece. There's one chapter where he talks about sexuality a bit, but the gender and sexuality bits are not really focused on. It is primarily focused on the fact that a lot of modern ideas about both ethnicity and nationality are very modern. And he presents a lot of it as kind of being trapped in 19th century ideas about group dynamics and as well as colonialism, but it doesn't really feel like rethinking. I think most people who have given kind of the question of modern identity elements any thought have thought these things, and the people who haven't or who bristle at the idea of it would not be picking up this book. So I was a little bit baffled as to who this is for. I did think it was funny. His writing style still does have a very British style to it, but it's written in American English because, again, he is somebody who spent his entire professional life pretty much in the US, and that contrast was interesting, which maybe, I don't know, probably unintentionally says something about my expectations around language. He talks somewhat about language. He never actually says the line that a language is a dialect with an army, but he kind of talks around that when he does talk about language groups in Ghana, so there is some of that. But yeah, this is quite short, and I think for a topic like this, it needed to be either meatier or it needed to be a memoir. And instead it was really neither one. It was just not enough of, there are basically 3 elements in this, and it didn't feel like pop sociology, and it didn't feel like a pop academic book, and it didn't feel like a memoir. It just had bits and pieces. So I like the idea of this, and there were a lot of individual points that I thought were kind of interesting. Oh, there is also quite a bit about religion as well. But yeah, I felt like it was exclusively making the point that a lot of divisions are not necessarily artificial, because that's really not the way to say it. Like, it is modern constructions, but that doesn't make them artificial because they do have bearing on how people live their lives and how people interact with each other. But he never really goes beyond that, which I thought was kind of a shame, but it is what it is. I guess if you're looking for a kind of 101 type exploration of those bits of identity, I think maybe this would be a good choice for that. But as it was, I thought there just wasn't much to it, ultimately. Because it is October, I feel like everybody and their brother is reading for Victober, so I bowed to peer pressure and went through my Penguin Little Black Classics box to look for some Victorian things, and I found Henry Mayhew's Of Street Piemen. This is a collection of individual articles that he published in the 1850s regarding the working lives of poor and working class Londoners. The title essay is following piemen who go selling their pies on the streets, and how the existence of pie shops is cutting into their profits. He talks about orphan children selling flowers. Yes, it is largely depressing because it is the 1850s and people are living in squalor and doing a lot of work for not very much payment. As with a lot of these little black classics that are not, say, short stories or single long articles, this is part of a larger collection. However, these were originally published as single pieces. That's not necessarily an issue in and of itself. As to whether these are interesting, it is interesting if you want to know factoids about Victorian era working conditions. If you don't, I don't think this is particularly compelling on its own. It is the kind of thing that maybe you would read. I saw somebody on Goodreads say this would be great if you were writing some historical fiction with this kind of setting, because it does give you that eye into it. So it was interesting, but yeah, I don't think there was much more to that other than it being kind of generally interesting. Another readathon that's happening this month is the Disability Readathon, and with that in mind, at the library I picked up A Quick and Easy Guide to Sex and Disability by A. Andrews. This is part of Limerence Press's Quick and Easy Guide series. The book that I see reviewed most often on BookTube is A Quick and Easy Guide to They, Them Pronouns, which this format, which is short comic guides, makes sense for something like that. The art is good and the general messaging is good, but it's such a broad topic that I felt like this seemed incredibly slight in a way that a lot of these guides, when they are for something more specific, just aren't. Like, this doesn't really know if it is aimed at able-bodied people who are considering being in a, I don't know, mixed ability relationship, just random people on the street who would be tempted to ask wheelchair users if they can have sex, which don't do that. Is it addressing stereotypes that people might have in between disability categories? Like, do people with mental illness have this kind of stereotype of people with spinal cord injuries, or vice versa? Again, that's addressed, but because of how short this is, it can't really get into any of that. Some of it seems like it's for both sets of audiences. Some of it feels like it might be for somebody who's newly disabled or who is a teenager and kind of coming into their sexuality for the first time that way. And again, because this is so short, it doesn't really do any of those different topics particular justice. So I was kind of left thinking, who is this really for? I mean, it's a nice message. I think it's something that you could put on a shelf at a school, high school, I guess, library, and have there and have as a conversation starter, but as a book on its own, it just was so broad that I don't think this is the right format for that. I mean, I think the author and artist could clearly have done something better with a longer format. The format was really holding this back, and it's just weird. I think I was hoping that this was going to be something that more obviously would be specifically for a, say, late teenage audience who are probably digging through a lot of the social stereotypes. And I appreciate that the author's trying to check off all these other things, but for such a small, short little book, yeah, it just didn't do enough of anything, I thought, which was a shame. The art is nice though, so there you go. And finally, I read Jason's On the Camino. Jason is a Norwegian comic artist who lives in France, and for his 50th birthday, he decided to walk the Camino de Santiago, which a lot of people do either because they're super into hiking, and a lot of hikers do this to brag about it, or because they are very religious Catholics and they do it as a pilgrimage. Jason is neither one of those things. He's not an avid hiker and he's an atheist, but he decided it was a good midlife crisis to have to do this hike. I think the reception of this book has suffered because people go into it expecting that a book about this hike will have extremely detailed images of the scenery and the villages that they walk through, and this does not. This is Jason's signature style, which is a very stripped back, simple style, anthropomorphic animals, and the story is very repetitive because it's not scenery, and because he's not doing this for any really intense hiking, bragging, or religious cause. It is a lot of very repetitive. He stays in this hostel, he hikes this distance, he stays in this hostel, he hikes this distance. At each one he meets new people, he makes the same joke about, or he just turned 50, so he's either going to buy a Porsche or do this hike, so he did the hike. And I personally thought that was incredibly charming. I liked hearing him have these same interactions as he met new people along the way and found out what country everybody was from. He chose not to take a cell phone with him so that he would have the possibility of getting a little more lost than people can be sometimes. So I was charmed by this, but I think if you were going into this hoping that this hiking trip or this pilgrimage trip, whichever your perspective might be, is going to be very either scenic or very spiritual, you're not going to get either of those things. This is very much a slice of life book that happens to be on this well-known hiking trail. So I enjoyed this, but I think it's very definitely a book that is not going to be for everyone. So, as usual, I'll have hopefully inserted some images of the art here. But yeah, I thought it was worthwhile, but it's one, know what you're getting into with it. In any case, that's mostly what I read this week. I also read Manning Marable's biography of Malcolm X, Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention, but I'm taking part in a group read of the autobiography of Malcolm X that Cousin from Always Doing is hosting, which is a great group. We've had some really interesting discussions, not even just about the book, but in any case, I think I'll talk about that with the other book at some point in the future. So yeah, anyway, if you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought of them. If you're reading books for Victober or for the Disability Readathon, what are you reading? And yeah, that's it for now. Ciao.